In the year 986 AD, legendary Viking explorer Erik the Red led a group of Norse settlers across the icy North Atlantic to the remote and barren land we now call Greenland. Against all odds, they built a thriving colony with farms, churches, and bustling trade routes that connected them to Europe. For over 400 years, the Vikings survived in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But then, mysteriously, they disappeared. By the 15th century, the settlements had been completely abandoned. Thousands of men, women, and children vanished without a trace, leaving behind only desolate ruins and a mystery that has baffled historians and archaeologists for centuries. What happened to these Viking settlers? Were they victims of the brutal Arctic climate? Did they fall in battle to the native Inuit people? Or did a complete collapse in trade with Europe seal their fate? Could they have starved, frozen, or perhaps sailed away in search of a new land? Today, we explore the chilling mystery of the lost Viking colony of Greenland. Join us as we dive deep into the ancient world of the Norse, unearth the clues left behind, and uncover the theories that try to explain this ancient enigma. In 986 AD, legendary Norse explorer Erik the Red led a group of Viking settlers to the remote and icy shores of Greenland. Having been exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, Erik sought to establish a new home in a land he had previously explored. He named it Greenland in the hope that the pleasant-sounding name would attract more settlers, and indeed it did. A fleet of Viking ships arrived with families, livestock, and supplies, and soon, a thriving colony was established. For the first few centuries, the Viking settlements in Greenland flourished. They built farms, churches, and trading hubs along the coasts, adapting to the harsh environment. Although the land was cold and barren, the Vikings utilized the fertile meadows for raising sheep and cattle. They also hunted seals, whales, and walruses, using their meat, blubber, and ivory for trade. At its peak, the Greenlandic colony boasted two main settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, with a population estimated to be around 3,000 to 5,000 people. The Vikings maintained strong trade connections with Europe, exporting valuable goods such as walrus ivory, sealskins, and wool. This trade was vital to their survival, as it provided them with essential resources like iron, timber, and grain, which were scarce in Greenland. In addition to farming and trade, the settlers were devout Christians, building grand churches, including the famous Valsey Church, the ruins of which still stand today. However, by the 15th century, these once prosperous settlements were mysteriously abandoned. Archaeological evidence shows that the last written record from Greenland is a wedding held at Valsey Church in 1408. After that, the Norse settlers seemed to vanish without a trace. So what went wrong? One of the most prominent theories explaining the disappearance of the Viking settlers in Greenland is the impact of climate change, specifically the onset of the Little Ice Age. This period of global cooling, which began around the 14th century and lasted into the 19th century, had devastating effects on many parts of the world, but especially on those living in the far north, like Greenland. When the Vikings first arrived in Greenland around 986 AD, the climate was relatively mild, allowing them to establish thriving agricultural settlements. The settlers, led by Erik the Red, built farms and raised livestock, primarily sheep, goats, and cattle. They utilized the meadows around the fjords, which were productive enough to sustain their animals and produce hay for the winter months. For a few centuries, the Vikings managed to live off the land, supplemented by hunting, fishing, and trade with Europe. However, around the 1300s, the climate began to shift dramatically. The onset of the Little Ice Age brought colder temperatures, longer winters, and shorter growing seasons. The fertile meadows that once supported Viking agriculture started to shrink under the increasing ice and snow. As the winters grew harsher, it became more difficult for the settlers to grow enough food to feed both their animals and themselves. Livestock numbers dwindled as pastures became barren, and the Vikings were forced to slaughter their animals earlier than usual just to survive. This drastic climate change also affected their ability to harvest resources from the sea. The colder temperatures caused the sea ice to extend further south, making fishing and seal hunting more difficult. Seals, a vital source of food and clothing for the Vikings, became harder to catch, and many of the settlers' traditional food sources started to decline. As the Little Ice Age progressed, the Viking way of life became increasingly unsustainable. The combination of failed crops, dwindling livestock, and scarce resources led to malnutrition and starvation. The harsh climate also impacted their homes, as it became harder to keep warm during the long, cold winters, further exacerbating the difficulties of daily life. Moreover, the worsening climate would have made contact with Europe more challenging. Increased sea ice and stormier conditions made voyages to and from Greenland treacherous. As trade routes collapsed, the settlers could no longer rely on imported goods like iron for tools, wood for building, and grain for food. Cut off from the rest of the world and struggling to adapt to the increasingly brutal environment, the Viking population in Greenland began to dwindle. In the end, the Little Ice Age likely played a crucial role in the decline and eventual disappearance of the Greenlandic Viking colony. Their once prosperous settlements, dependent on agriculture and trade, could not withstand the challenges of a rapidly cooling world. The settlers were left vulnerable, facing starvation, isolation, and the collapse of their society as Greenland became an even more inhospitable land. Another theory surrounding the disappearance of the Viking settlers in Greenland points to potential conflicts with the indigenous Inuit people. The Thule Inuit arrived in Greenland around the 13th century, about 200 years after the Vikings had established their settlements. The Thule, ancestors of today's Inuit, were highly skilled in surviving the harsh Arctic conditions. Unlike the Vikings, who relied on farming and livestock, the Inuit were expert hunters and fishers, using advanced tools like kayaks, harpoons, and dog sleds to thrive in the cold climate. Initially, it's possible that the two groups coexisted peacefully, even trading goods and knowledge. Archaeological evidence shows that the Vikings may have adopted some Inuit survival techniques, such as using seal blubber for fuel. However, over time, as the climate worsened during the Little Ice Age, competition for resources may have intensified. With their traditional farming methods failing due to the colder climate, the Vikings may have found themselves increasingly dependent on hunting and fishing, areas where the Inuit excelled. This overlap could have led to tensions and clashes as both groups vied for the limited resources in an increasingly inhospitable environment. Some historians and archaeologists suggest that these conflicts could have turned violent. The Inuit, who were better adapted to Greenland's extreme conditions, may have driven the Vikings out of their remaining settlements or even wiped them out. While there is no definitive evidence of large-scale warfare, some remains have been found with indications of trauma, hinting at possible violent encounters. In this theory, the combination of climate stress and conflict with the Inuit may have hastened the collapse of the Viking colony, contributing to their mysterious disappearance from Greenland. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence regarding the fate of the Viking settlers in Greenland is a letter written in 1408 from a church in Valsø, the largest and best-preserved Viking ruin in Greenland. This letter is significant because it marks the last known recorded communication from the Norse Greenlandic colony before it vanished into the mists of history. The letter in question details a wedding held in Valsø Church between a prominent Icelandic couple, Thorstein Olafsson and Sigrid Bjornsdottir. The letter, sent to friends and family back in Iceland, describes the ceremony and the peaceful life in the Valsø settlement, but it also inadvertently captures the eerie sense of isolation and fragility of the colony at that time. At first glance, it seems like an ordinary correspondence, not unlike any other medieval communication, focusing on personal and social matters rather than offering any insight into impending doom. However, its historical significance lies in the fact that this letter was the final written document from the Greenlandic Vikings. After this letter, there is no further record of contact with the Greenland colony. The settlements went silent, with no more ships arriving in Europe from Greenland and no further communications from its people. This sudden and complete silence has led to widespread speculation about the colony's ultimate fate. Was the wedding letter a final goodbye, unknowingly written as the colony was on the brink of collapse? Many historians believe that the climate changes brought by the Little Ice Age and the increasing isolation from Europe were already taking their toll on the Greenland Vikings. The fact that a wedding was still being celebrated in 1408 suggests that, at least in Valsø, life may have been continuing somewhat normally, yet this was a brief respite before the end. There are several possibilities as to why this was the last communication. One theory is that soon after the wedding, the remaining settlers may have succumbed to the worsening climate conditions. The declining temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and harsher winters likely made survival increasingly difficult. Without regular trade or supplies from Europe, the settlers may have starved, frozen, or abandoned their homes in a last-ditch effort to find help, perhaps even sailing west to the unknown lands of North America. Another theory posits that the Greenlanders may have slowly migrated away from their settlements, possibly integrating with the local Inuit populations. Some evidence suggests that there was contact between the Norse and the Inuit, though whether it was peaceful or violent remains debated. Ultimately, the letter from 1408 stands as a haunting reminder of a thriving colony on the edge of collapse. It gives us a glimpse of life in Greenland just before the settlers vanished, leaving behind a centuries-old mystery that has yet to be solved. Did they perish due to environmental conditions? Or did they sail into the unknown in search of a new home? The letter remains one of the last tantalizing clues to what happened to the lost Viking colony of Greenland. In recent decades, archaeological efforts in Greenland have provided new insights into the mysterious disappearance of the Viking settlers. Excavations of the ancient Viking sites, particularly in the eastern and western settlements, have unearthed significant evidence that sheds light on the final days of the Norse colony. Among the most compelling discoveries are the ruins of Viking structures, including homes, churches, and farms. These ruins reveal a once thriving society that adapted to Greenland's harsh environment with impressive architectural and agricultural ingenuity. However, the artifacts found alongside these ruins tell a more somber story. Archaeologists have uncovered numerous human remains at these sites, and analysis of these skeletons has provided critical clues. One of the most striking aspects of the findings is the absence of signs of violent trauma or conflict. Unlike other historical sites where evidence of warfare or abrupt destruction is evident, the remains of the Greenland Vikings show no clear indications of battles or violent confrontations. The lack of evidence for violence suggests that the decline of the Viking colony was not sudden or catastrophic, but rather a gradual and agonizing process. The settlers likely faced worsening conditions over time, including harsh winters, food shortages, and a decline in trade. The slow deterioration of their environment may have led to malnutrition and disease, which could have contributed to their gradual decline. Moreover, some excavations have revealed evidence of abandoned and deteriorated buildings, which supports the idea that the settlers were slowly abandoning their homes in a desperate attempt to survive. The gradual accumulation of refuse and debris in these abandoned structures indicates that people continued to live and use these spaces for some time before ultimately leaving or dying. In summary, modern excavations have provided chilling yet insightful glimpses into the final days of Greenland's Viking settlers. The evidence suggests a slow and painful decline rather than a sudden catastrophe, painting a picture of a colony that gradually faded away, victim to the unforgiving conditions of their environment. The fate of Greenland's Viking colony is one of history's most enduring enigmas. Despite extensive research and excavation, the exact reasons for their disappearance remain shrouded in mystery. By the late 15th century, the once thriving settlements had vanished, leaving behind only ruins and unanswered questions. Several theories attempt to explain this disappearance. One possibility is that the settlers succumbed to the harsh climate conditions brought on by the Little Ice Age, leading to failed crops, dwindling resources, and starvation. Another theory suggests conflicts with the Inuit, who arrived in Greenland around the same time, might have led to violent encounters or competition for resources. Additionally, some speculate that the Vikings might have been driven away by a complete collapse in trade with Europe or might have sought refuge elsewhere, possibly even sailing to unknown lands in search of a new home. Despite these theories, no definitive evidence has been found to conclusively explain what happened. The truth about the Viking colony's fate may still be buried beneath Greenland's ice, waiting for future explorers and researchers to uncover. Until then, the disappearance of the Vikings remains an intriguing and unresolved mystery, captivating the imagination of historians and archaeologists alike. Whatever their fate, the lost Vikings of Greenland left behind an eerie legacy, one that continues to haunt historians and adventurers alike. The question remains, will we ever truly know what happened to them? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more mysteries from history. Until next time, keep searching for the truth.